He says, when I was about 4 years old, my father found himself able to buy the lease of a house on Herne Hill, a rustic eminence 4 miles south of the Standard in Cornhill, of which the leafy seclusion remains in all essential points of character unchanged to this day. Now, Ruskin's writing in the early 1880s now. Hasn't changed too much by then. Certain Gothic splendors lately indulged in by our wealthier neighbors being the only serious innovations. And these are so graciously concealed by the fine trees of their grounds that the passing viator remains unappalled by them. And I can still walk up and down the piece of the road between the Fox Tavern and the Herne Hill station, imagining myself 4 years old. Our house was the northernmost of a group that stand accurately on the top or dome of the hill, where the ground is for a small space level, as the snows are on the dome of Mont Blanc. Presently falling, however, in what may be in the London clay formation, considered a precipitous slope to our valley of Chamonix, that is Dulwich, on the east, with a softer descent into Cold Harbour Lane. The group of which our house was the quarter consisted of 2 precisely similar partler houses, couples of houses, gardens, and all to match. Still, the 2 highest blocks of buildings seen from norward on the crest of the ridge, so that the house itself, 3-storied, with garrets above, commanded in those comparatively smokeless days a very notable view from its garret windows of the Norwood Hills on the one side. Imagine this now, even London's better than it was. With a view on the one side of the valley of the Thames, and on the other with Windsor telescopically clear in the distance, and Harrow conspicuous always in fine weather to open vision against the summer sunset. Now he gets to the garden. In the front and back garden, in sufficient proportion to its size, it had one of those. The front richly set in old evergreens and well-grown lilac and laburnum, and the back 70 yards long by 20 wide. Renowned all over the hill for its pears and apples, which had been chosen with extreme care by our predecessor, and possessing also a strong old mulberry tree, a tall white-heart cherry tree, a black Kentish one, and an almost unbroken hedge, all round of alternate gooseberry and currant bush. Always nature for Ruskin, beauties of nature. All of it so informative and formative for him. Decked in due season with magical splendor of abundant fruit, fresh green, soft amber, and rough bristled crimson bending with spinous branches, clustered pearl and pendant ruby joyfully discoverable under the large leaves that looked like thunder. That was his garden. How lovely it was here. He then goes on to say that when he was a little boy, all fruit in the garden was forbidden. And then he goes on to explain later on what he meant by that. He didn't mean that he could never eat any of the fruit, but he could only eat it when it was ripe. His mother was very exacting about this. She knew exactly when the fruit was ripe to be picked, and she made sure that it was only done and then. And he says here at the end of the passage, which I'll share with you. So very early from my mother, I got in my thoughts this idea of trees, and I got into my idea, the principle given 50 years later in Proserpine, that's the book he wrote about plants in later life. And this is important because we'll come back to that, that the seeds and fruits of the trees were for the sake of the flowers, not the flowers for the fruit. The first joy of the year being in his snowdrops, the second and the cardinal one being the almond blossom, every other garden in woodland gladness flowing from that in unbroken order of kindling flower and shadowy leaf. And for many and many a year to come, indeed until the whole of life became autumn to me, my chief prayer for the kindness of heaven in its flowerful seasons was that the frost might not touch the almond blossom. And the title of the chapter is Herne Hill, Almond Blossoms. So that's what he grew up with. And we were very lucky. Margaret did a wonderful thing. She found a way for us to meet the people who lived in the house, and the lady of the house was home. So we went to the house where Ruskin's house would have been, but it's not Ruskin's house. That's been demolished. This is another house. And there we are at the front door. And this is what the garden looks like. And she apologized up and down, her name was Pam, about the condition of the garden. But I was delighted to go. I thought it was wonderful to be in the garden. And here's Jen and Margaret and Pam in the back garden looking back. And almost all the trees have gone, and this is the view off to the east from the yard that was once the Ruskin's yard. Yeah. And here's the brick wall, which is about the only thing that we found that we actually thought. Margaret was pretty convinced that this was the brick wall that would have gone around the house. It still was there, around the side. And out in front, in one corner, kind of neglected, there's a little post that the London Council had put up commemorating that John Ruskin had lived there. And Margaret had great foresight, and she came out and had this wonderful stuff so we could copy it and get a version of it. It's got a rubbing of it to take home. So there we are working on that. And there we've got it. Yeah. And his second house was down the road, not very far actually, some hundreds of yards really. Actually his third home was Denmark Hill. His father had become really quite wealthy. I don't think one of the richest of the rich, but certainly very, very comfortable. And he bought this big mansion for the family. And Ruskin moved in there, of course, with the family, and that's their house. That's really wonderful. Near the end of Praetorian, his autobiography, Ruskin writes this about that back garden. I now draw back to my own home 20 years ago, permitted to thank heaven once more for the peace and hope and loveliness of it, and the Elysian walks with Joni, that's Joan Severn, who lived with him here for all those many years, his cousin, and paradisical walks with Rosie, that's Rose Latouche, his young love, under the peach blossom branches by the little glittering stream, which I had paved with crystal for them. I had built behind the highest cluster of laurels a reservoir, and from which, on sunny afternoons, I could let a quite rippling film of water run for a couple of hours down behind the hayfield, where the grass in spring still grew fresh and deep. There used to always be a corncrake or two in it. Twilight after twilight I have hunted that bird and never once got a glimpse of it. The voice was always on the other side of the field, or in the inscrutable air or earth, and the little stream had its falls and pools and imaginary lakes, and here and there it laid for itself lines of graceful sand, and there and here it lost itself under beads of chalcedony. It wasn't the Liffey, nor the Nith, nor the Wandle, but the two girls were surely a little cruel to call it the gutter. Happiest times for all of us that ever were to be, not but that Joni and her Arthur are giddy enough, both of them, yet with their 5 little ones. But they have been sorely anxious about me, and I have been sorrowful enough for myself, since ever I lost sight of that peach blossom avenue. Edenland, Rosie called it sometimes in her letters. Whether its tiny river were of the waters of Albana, or Euphrates, or Thamesis, I know not, but they were never sweeter to my thirst. They were sweeter to my thirst than the fountains of Trevi or Brantwood. So that was Denmark Hill. And here it is now. Council housing. House long gone. Back of the council housing. But somebody's got a nice little and just up the road, this was I think it was 8 acres that they had. About 8 acres that they had. They had another council flat named Ruskin Court. It's a happy place to be. Nearby, there's Ruskin Park down front, and that's nice. It is. It has a lovely view of the city. Here's the city up here. Yeah. And nearby was a street, a passageway called Croxton Lane. And that's probably what Ruskin saw when he was growing up there. And then a bit later, as the development came south from London in large numbers, it began to look like that. And he wrote very disparagingly about it. Later on, in the storm cloud of the 19th century, he writes this passage about the corruption of the skies of London and how the city becomes just covered with smoke, and you can't see anything, and whatever purity was there and all the things that he talked about have disappeared, and people don't know, and people know but they don't care, or they don't know what to do about it, and so on. He says, I've been telling you for 3 decades what you should do about it, and they don't do it. And this one I think is really interesting. This is a memorial to Ruskin. I want you to look carefully at this, because this is quite, there's a church nearby. There's a number of memorials to Ruskin in the churches nearby in the Herne Hill and Denmark Hill area, but this is in a church called St. Paul's, a little parish church not too far, just down the road from his old home. And Jim Dearden, who's so important to the Ruskin world, Jim Dearden's written a little book about Ruskin's Camberwell and the places where he's memorialized in Herne Hill and so on. And he describes this medallion, or this thing on the wall of the church or no, this is how they describe it. First, this is how they describe it, and then he has a comment about it at the end. And we know Ruskin's love of the Middle Ages, and here's their description of the church. The Ruskin Memorial contains a medallion of him sculptured in Greek statuary, mode of Pentelicus, on either side of which are panels in rose giallo antico, the whole under a canopy of white alabaster supported by columns of verde antico from Thessaly, with carved capitals copied for those in the apse of the Duomo of Milan. Between these columns is an inscription panel of Rosso Antico of Laconia with letters in white enamel, and under this is a frieze of antique Cipollino marble, with the whole being carried by a corbel carved with a Greek and acanthus bossed in the center to contain a circular plaque of Egyptian red porphyry. The Capolino marble is that used for the incrustation of the walls and great piers of St. Mark's, the quarries of which are at Christos in Greece. And as you can see, it's very much a classical Renaissance kind of memorial. And the portrait of Ruskin has to be one of the ugliest I've ever seen. And Jim finishes his inscription on this by saying, "This whole goes together to make what surely must be the most inappropriate Ruskin memorial imaginable to the mind of human beings who know him." What I'm really trying to get at here is this idea of Ruskin loves nature, the world and its purity, the goodness of it. I'll come back to this later on. The things that are outside our window right here, the mountain, the air, the water, all of these things, and we just pollute them. We don't care about them. We're so enamored of all the things and the things that make the things that we get. We forget about them and don't think about them. So let's go on to the next stop. Ruskin, south of London, there's a little town called Charlton. And Ruskin began to be very, concerned about this pollution, about the environment around London itself. And so he decided, this was an area when he grew up, the springs of the Wandle were there where he grew up, and the rivers were lovely and pure, and the air was clean, and the grass was wonderful. And he decided he was going to do something about it. His mother died in 1871, and by, I think it was 1876, he decided he was going to put up a memorial to her there, trying to clear out an area that had once been pure from all the refuse that was around it, and keep it pure and maintain it that way. And so this is the area, that used to be all, you can't see it right there, this used to be all water, this used to be a pool, and then it came out from a spring. And Jen and I found it hunting around the other day, and here is what it looks like now. Down here, I can show you this on there, can't I? That's the plaque itself. There was a later attempt by the city or the town or the London Council to try to clean all of this up. But I was there once about maybe 10 years ago when we first got interested in Ruskin, and Jim Deere told me how to find it. And it looked exactly like this 10 years ago. And so obviously whatever they've done, they haven't thought much about it. But here's what the plaque says. It says, "In obedience to the giver of life, of the brooks and fruits that feed it, of the peace that ends it, may this wall be kept sacred for the service of men, flocks, and flowers, and be by kindness called Margaret's Well. This pool was beautified and endowed by John Ruskin, Esquire, M.A., LLB." This is from Cook's biography of Ruskin. He writes, "The project, however, failed. The stream was again fouled by the action of the local authorities. The inscription was taken down, and though at the close of 1880 we find him again reverting to the subject in his diary, that's Ruskin, and proposing a fresh inscription, nothing now remains to record his attempt." Well, the plaque was put back in, and now maybe we can do a little bit more of this. A couple of videos here. Give you a sense of finding it in this shape.